So we have a dilemma, and it's a dilemma we share at the Danielsen Institute often. We find ourselves coming to a point and saying, we need more time. What we did at the Danielsen Institute in the training program is we extended our fellowships to 2 years from 1 year, but we don't have that option tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call upon my colleague, Dr. Denisa Husarova, one of the clinical staff from the Danielsen, to come and do the impossible, and that is to continue the discussion until 5 o'clock. We'll leave some space, although it'll be limited, for a couple questions from the participants here, and we will close things down at 5. At 5, after we dismiss, again, please, those of you who have continuing education credits, complete your evaluations and take them outside. There will also be a book signing and a cocktail reception out in the foyer, so you can continue discussions out there. So with that, I'm going to invite Denisa to the stage and see where we go from here.
Well, let me begin by saying how honored I feel to sit with the three soulful men who are very much the three pillars themselves in fields of psychology, sociology, education, and theology. And you certainly invited all of us into depths of some of the most important existential questions. And I think I speak on behalf of the entire room when we say we're eager to see you bring your minds, your hearts, your ideas into more direct play and dialogue during this discussion time. So I will open it up by question. You just had an opportunity to sit with each other, hear each other, and I'm curious what are the 1 or 2 points that really stood out in listening and hearing each other speak.
I have like about 87 points. So you don't want me to speak the remaining 85.
I'm sorry, that's the ugly part of my role.
I know the time is short. I mean, I must say that I'm very impressed, touched, and informed. Both discussions affected me, but differently. And in different parts of me. It's like having analysis with 2 different kinds of analysts. So they did affect me, both of them, but differently. In the first discussion, and I'm hesitating pronouncing names because I'm not yet familiar with your names and I don't want to mispronounce. So in the first discussion, I think the 3 things that impressed me most in the first discussion, one was the issue of the background. And that is, we assume what Joseph Sandler called the background of safety. But that is not true of lots of people and lots of situations and lot of kind of childhoods and so on. And sometimes one hopes that there's background of safety from which one begins. And then faith and vision are givens, as against what Yolanda Gamble has called the background of uncanniness, from which the faith and vision and survival are both defensive and adaptive needs and desperate developmental requirements. So I think that there occurs a different flavor to the 2. In the end, they might meet up someplace. I think by the time you cannot multiply your age by 2 and be absolutely certain that you'll be alive, I think they begin to come together. But that was supposed to be a joke, thank you. Don't take it so seriously, everyone. So that's one thing. I think the issue of background that you raised, I think is a very important issue. Also hidden in the issue of background is the issue of temporality. Because in one side you talked about the background of uncanniness and background of unsafety, versus the sentence I think you attributed to somebody I didn't catch, that every loving moment is a beginning. So that there is the future and the background is the past. So that everything we are talking about has to be ultimately related to the temporal issue and the passage of time and its effect. A patient of mine, 57-year-old, just 3 days ago said, I wish I could be 25 again, because now I'm sort of, really know what I'm doing. But the patient herself says, but I don't think so. I don't really want to be 25. Because, come on, I look at 25-year-olds, they don't know what they're doing. So, and in response, immediately I said, I think there's a difference between touching the water and knowing the river. Now, this sentence is, as you said about the mutual gaze, it was evoked by the patient. It is mine, and yet it is evoked in that moment. Right? So I think that the background is important, the issue of bilaterality that is also implicit in you quoting Levinas, to whom I was introduced only about 2 months ago by somebody, and somebody who said you have to read Levinas and such. So I think the temporality, the bilaterality, and also you touched upon the issue of iconography. You see, about some 3 or 4 years ago, the International Psychoanalytic Association, in their quarterly newsletters, started publishing the pictures of insides of other analysts' offices. And as I saw those pictures, I could imagine myself being an analyst in this office, but not in that office. Right? There's something, many times patients come and we think that they adore us and like us and we are so cute and wise. 3 years down the road, the patient tells that they picked us as their analyst because they liked the lamp in the office, or that the carpet was something, something, right? And there is the traditional psychoanalytic, which is 90%, I think true also, is that a lamp, a grandfather clock, a desk, a plant, a carpet, it stands for mommy, daddy, and childhood relationships. I think that's only 90% true. 10 times, mommy and daddy stand for carpets and grandfather clocks. That I think the human beings also have direct relatedness, non-symbolic direct relatedness to the ecology and physical environment. And sometimes those things create transferences. So I think you mentioned about temporality, iconography, and bilaterality. Those were the 3 points that I got, which have to be anchored into this, and these ideas have to be anchored into those 3 things. Which are there. The issue of iconography is more there, but temporality and bilaterality not in my paper. That needs to be further thought about. Your discussion had the impact of me. I reminded of a story. One of my books was reviewed in Psychoanalytic Quarterly by Bob Glick, who's a psychoanalyst in New York. And I ran into him and I said, Bob, this is, you've made an interpretation. You've not really written a book review. You've just interpreted me. And he said, what else is a book review? And I think, so in a way, you're a polite person and obviously a decent person. So you didn't act like Harold Searles. If Harold Searles was there, he would have told me, look, are you missing your mother still? So, but this is precisely what you have said, and in a way, rightly so. I think that the questions you raise about the gaps, about what lets us go on, the commonality of these 3 pillars that I proposed, even your interesting pick up on the word pillar and its linkage to Islam, because you see, while my father was an atheist, very rabid atheist, telling children, both me and my brother, vocally and vehemently never to believe in God. But I had this Hindu wannabe mother and a grandfather who was deeply religious, And then the 4 deaths of very important people from age 4 to age 10, led me to this faith hunger, so to speak. And I think that you're saying about the pillars, that something of my grandfather must be in me also. So the choice of the word, Islamic word, etc., etc. So I think that your commentary worked as a very interesting interpretation. Now here I'll tell you another story which is sort of weird and sort of true. Is both. It's weird and spooky, but it's also true. True not in the sense that the story is true, but true in the sense that there's something in there. And that is that I spent about 3.5 hours with Masood Khan 6 months before he died. He was, those of you young people who don't know, he was an Indian man who arrived in England in 1943 to study James Joyce and to do a PhD on James Joyce. Ran into James Strachey, who was Freud's translator, and both of them were big drinkers. And so James and Masood Khan became friendly, got introduced to psychoanalysis, became a psychoanalyst, was an extremely gifted writer, very witty man, very wealthy, for an Indian, very tall, even for an American, 6'8" tall. Big, tall, rich, handsome, witty, intelligent guy who was quite gifted, but he was also quite unwell, seriously narcissistic and sociopathic, who became very bright, very great achiever, and then from bright he went to weird, from weird he went to sick, from sick he went to mean and evil, and then he died. So then God, yeah, then
I'm glad to be associated with that.
Yeah, no, I'm coming. And then God took mercy on him and killed him. So, but he was, even when he was evil and mean, and he was towards the end, a tragic but gifted and intelligent figure. So in the only time I met him for 3.5 hours, 6 months before he died, he said to me, and this was 1988. So he said to me, brother, the problem with you is, and he was not able to talk, so he was writing. He wrote and gave it to me. And he wrote, brother, the problem with you is that you shall never write. That you shall never write. Now, I had written some 30, 40 papers by that time, and I had edited one book, and I was writing the first book that I was writing, Broken Structures. So I wrote back, I spoke, I said, no, I've published some 40 papers, and about 6 of them in psychoanalytic journals and such. And he wrote a very interesting thing. He wrote on a piece of paper, he gave it to me, I read, it says, I'm not talking of that kind of writing. Now, that is what your discussion reminded me of. Do you see, what did he mean? That sentence has remained with me. What did he mean by I'm not talking of that kind of writing? Meaning a formal, a structure-bound, a literature clinging, a kind of frightened and writing. That, like in American psychoanalysis, in all honesty, from 1940 till 1970, I think there might be 2 papers and 1 monograph that was worth anything. I'm sorry. This is my opinion. I think that all psychoanalysis from till the time Freud died, 1939 till about late 60s or early 70s, was only good boy and good girl stuff. Same, writing papers to prove Freud right, which is nonsense. It's only 70s that things began. Kohut, Kernberg, Mahler, Daniel Stern, new things began to happen, right? So I think that's what he was meaning. Now he was a kind of a little too far out of the field and too weird, but he did touch on some fear in me by pointing that out. And both stirred that fear and liberated me from that fear by that comment, years later. So I think that same way in your discussion, I find the same kind of, you are much gentler, certainly less crazy than Masood Khan, and I'm just joking, that you're a polite and decent person, but you've touched upon both the common substrate of the background, as you said, of the background of my psyche, and my ambivalence towards it, my struggle with it, and the need of it to settle with it and to be more comfortable with it without breaking the tether. You see, I said to you that when I began to realize that psychoanalysis has little to do with India, or with Islam, or with poetry, or and Hinduism, which are my basic building blocks, then I had to decide, am I going to be a psychoanalyst, stay a psychoanalyst or not? And then I had to stretch the tether, move away, start writing about new things. So I did two books on animals and man's involvement with animals, one book on man's involvement with physical objects, then one edited book in India, one in Islam, which I dedicated to my grandfather. And I wrote who was a devout Muslim and a good man. I was going to write devout Muslim but a good man, but I would have gotten one Salman under fatwa is enough. One Salman under fatwa is enough, right? So, and the book is called The Crescent and the Couch. Originally, I was naming Crescent or the Couch, but again, I bit my tongue, But and I did a book on China, Japan, and Korea, and just now on African American people. Exactly what both of you hinted, that psychoanalysis has ignored and mistreated the African Americans. And a big book just came out that I have put together with great work. So I'm trying to be as authentic without going wild as possible. And that's the only thing you can do, right? You are in a circus, you are in a circus, See, in the classical view of man, which Freud embodies, we are animals. We are like monkeys, and civilization has tamed us to stop being monkeys. And put on a tie, put on sunglasses, ride motorcycle in a circus. Now, is that really our nature? And psychoanalysis says, classical analysis, that the pleasure principle wants to come up, and if it overwhelms the ego, we become psychotic. If it splits the ego, we become perverts. If it comes through reality, we become neurotic. Right? So the best outcome is being neurotic. But that implies a particular view of man. Winnicott, Fairbairn do not have that view. They have a view that the monkey should not be in a circus. Here the idea is that you should behave better and don't eat too many peanuts, wait till 5 o'clock, then, and meanwhile ride the motorcycle and put on the tie. That's the classical psychoanalysis, which will make you more conventional if you undergo it. The romantic psychoanalysis of Winnicott and Ballant will make you more authentic, and authenticity has its own dangers, right? So I think we have to find somewhere a compromise. That doesn't mean 50-50. In some things more this, some things more this. Some kind of compromise all human beings have to find between conventionality and authenticity. And that is a struggle, both in writing, in working, in teaching. One little example also, and that is about the boundaries you said. That the boundaries, certainly the boundaries have meaning and purposes. Ethical boundaries, legal boundaries, sexual boundaries, aggressive boundaries, physical boundaries. Nonetheless, whatever is necessary has to be done. And there are other examples like that. Anyway.
We're unfortunately running out of time, and I would like to give some space to Dr. Cottle, Dr. Schlauch. Any thoughts, impressions?
Go ahead, Chris. I'm thinking here.
I have more of an association to a clinical conference I was in training, that there are some moments where you don't speak prematurely as though to impose something. I feel almost as though I have to let it...
Same with your discussion, yeah. You asked so many questions.
You talked about not speaking but listening, and I think for me to say anything worth saying requires my letting what I've tried to listen to find a place where I can say something worth saying. So that's as far as I can take it.
I think I share that. I will tell you a story that has come to mind. I have, and I think you hear it, and as I look back, listen to myself, I think, and I was talking to Chris and George about this, I think you hear me having not ambivalence about psychoanalysis, but a rocky history with it. And I'll tell you how it goes a little bit. At the Anna Freud Clinic, where I was for 2 years, I heard a case presentation, and it was a case of a little girl, and you don't need to know any of the details of it other than the fact that, I think we talked about this once, that her father was a London cab driver. And when the determination was, quelle surprise, that she should undergo 4 days of a week of psychotherapy, the father said, no, but it's not possible, because he anticipated losing at least 3 hours a day of income. And that was seen as total resistance. You see the resistance. I raised my hand punk kid, the Yank. And I said, but why is that resistance? Isn't there some reality that a working class man is relying so much on the hours of the day? He is willing to come to bring his, but he can't, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm telling you, 125 women and 3 men looked at me as if to say, they shouldn't have come over in World War II. They shouldn't have come over after World War II. Who let him in? Okay. And I was ticked at Miss Freud. Days later, a case of a Lebanese child was brought in. Yada, 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 her problems, yada, 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 theory right down the line. I think Roy Schaefer was actually visiting at the clinic at that time. It was exciting to meet these people. And the discussion goes on, and characteristically, Miss Freud doesn't say a word. Miss Freud doesn't say a word. And finally, the person leading the discussion says, Miss Freud, you're uncharacteristically quiet. And Miss Freud, as we called her Miss Freud, said, and I almost fell out of the chair, I didn't realize we were treating people for the Middle East here. Okay. And now one further step. They asked me to give a talk. And the talk that I gave on was children in jail, which I alluded to, and I'm going to get to the point of what I'm thinking of. And I gave this talk, and afterwards, their about the fact that there were children in jail in the United States, as you all know, who've never been charged, who've never been in court. They sit there till they're 18, and then they're released. This came from the Children's Defense Fund, and they're a disproportionate number of African-American kids, yada, yada, and, you know, and probably what they get as a graduation ceremony is that they've been raped. Well, suddenly, like a cloud, all the psychoanalytic theory and all the postulates rose, and those 125 women and 3 men were weeping. They were weeping. Miss Freud comes up to me. I can still feel her hand. I can still see the big sandals that she wore. Do you remember? And she said, but please tell me this is not happening in England. And I said, it is. And she said, my God, this just takes me back. This just can't be. And in that moment, I had this kind of double feeling. And I guess that the point I'm getting at was, that was the humanity of psychoanalysis. I heard that humanity, and that hit me as hard, even harder than the treatment of that it is totally resistance. I won't go there.
May I say one thing in response?
Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Do you see, first of all, it is not possible to not be ambivalent about psychoanalysis, partly because of the nature of the subject and partly because of the psychoanalysts. You know, the psychoanalysts became so imperious and so know-it-all and so snooty and so secret handshake and everything, right? That it was impossible not to be ambivalent about them, you know. So some ambivalence about analysis and psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysts are worse than psychoanalysis. You know, so, really, I know they're all my brothers and sisters and my friends. You know, so I know this thing. The second thing I was saying was that another thing that struck me about this kind of split within the corpus of the discipline. You go to psychoanalyst funerals, and I've been to many because now my teachers are dying and I end up being at their funerals. And I was quite struck that there was no atheistic funeral. You know, all the funerals, you know, of the person who claimed to be such an atheist, send him to God. And they're talking about God. And I'm saying, listen, what is going on? This guy used to tell that he's an atheist. Why are you talking about? He should have written in his will, don't talk about God in my funeral. So what is going on, right? So that also struck me very deeply as a split-off situation. That you go to the funerals of psychoanalysts and see how much God is there. There's God everywhere in their funeral. And then they claim to be an atheist. I don't get it. You know, I make sure that in my funeral, you will have some good wine, good Indian food, and nice Indian poetry.
On that note, we unfortunately do have to end. We're leaving with many more questions, but perhaps it's not a bad thing. So it's been a privilege.
One quick comment.
Sure.
Can we get the mic to you?
brief comment. I noticed at the end of Chris Schlauch's talk that you had quite a number of questions, and I wasn't able to keep track of all of them. But I guess what has struck me the most about Dr. Akhtar's talk, and also I watched one of your talks on YouTube before coming here so I could become a little more familiar with your work, is that more than many people I've encountered, you are a human being first and a psychoanalyst second, and that makes a huge difference. I heard this once said about Erik Erikson, that when people came into his presence, he didn't even have to say anything, but they often felt better. I think it's your willingness to not hold on to the tenets of psychoanalysis as some kind of rigid framework that you have to follow, and perhaps not even always to have an answer to a question about why you did this rather than that. To use the theory when it helps you, and to go with that feeling, which perhaps happens before you even have a thought to tell you why it's there. And that's just struck me very much, and I thank you for that.
I can say to you that Erikson used to say to us, "I'm not selling psychoanalysis." And then he would pause with those sparkly blue eyes and that great silver hair and that enormous turquoise ring that he wore. He would smile, "But I'm not selling it down the river either."
Well, it's been a privilege and a gift. Thank you very much.
Thank you.